Oh, we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. Today, I am super excited to have Matthew Quick on the show with me. Matthew has a fairly new release. It is called We Are the Light. What an amazing book. Matthew was kind enough to
Thank you.
send me the book a couple of weeks ago. And Matthew, I'll go ahead and tell you when the book was delivered, I sat in my favorite reading chair later that night. It was about 8 o'clock, I guess, and had my lamp on and just had everything the way I like it. And the next thing I know, I look up and like 3 hours had gone by, and I was you know down to the last quarter of the book, and I didn't want it to end. And I I absolutely fell into the story. We're going to talk more about it in a minute, so people may not know quite what I'm talking about. But in the beginning, I felt like I was eavesdropping a little bit on someone
Mm,
else's experience, and it felt a little disconcerting in the beginning, but I found myself completely bonded with Lucas, and
mm.
it didn't take long at all, and I absolutely love what you've done with the book. So,
Oh, thank
welcome,
you so much.
and
Appreciate that.
thank you
I
for
feel
writing such
welcome.
an amazing book.
Ah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, before we get into talking specifically about the book, Matthew, I was talking with someone about the book um, a few days ago, and they said, "I think I know who Matthew Quick is. What genre does he write in?" And I found myself kind of scratching my head, and I was like, "Well, how do you describe a Matthew Quick book?" Because the new book is very similar to your previous books, and it's a departure in some ways,
Mm.
but it has all the hallmarks of a Matthew Quick book, if that makes any sense at all. So when someone asks you what kind of books do you write, how do you answer that, and where do you see, if we walk into a bookstore, because we know that genres are really helpful for pointing someone where to find a
Yeah,
particular kind of book they're looking for, where would you say that you live in the bookstore?
it's a really interesting question, and I do get this a lot, and I feel as though my answer is eternally disappointing people because I don't know that I live squarely in a genre. My
Yeah,
YA work, the young adult work, is obviously easy to say. This is
sure.
coming of age. YA lit, which is a lot easier to classify. But my adult stuff, I would say it lives somewhere in between commercial and literary. And depending on what chapter you're reading, I might lean one way or the other. Um, but I think one of the ways to describe it is that I write mental health lit. I think that I'm always writing about mental health issues. I'm writing about characters who are having a lot of internal, not just struggles, but a lot of internal dialogue. So I write
Yeah.
first person um, character driven novels. Which is interesting because a lot of my books have been optioned for film. So you would think that Hollywood would be more interested in plot. And so I think that I do have good story arcs, but I think
Yeah.
the engine of my books, they're all about somebody trying to figure out who they are as they are in flux and usually going through some type of crisis. That's what my books are about. When I try to label them, it becomes difficult because I've told the story many times, but I remember when I published Silver Linings and I was on book tour for the first time, I didn't really know what I had done. I had just poured my heart out on a page, and it
Yeah.
was funny because people would come through the signing line, and I'd have one person come up and shake my hand, being very jovial and saying, "This was the funniest book I ever read. I laughed all the way through it. Hilarious. Thank you so much. It was an easy, light read." And then the very next person would come through and say, "I love this book, but it was so depressing and I cried through the whole thing." And it was exactly the same book. And so, what I
Yeah.
learned from that is that when you're writing character driven fiction and you're writing from first person, it's largely how that reader, that individual reader, is interacting with the main character.
Yes.
So for We Are The Light, my main character, Lucas Goodgame, like how you interact with Lucas is how you're going to label the book. Like, do you sympathize with Lucas? Do you see yourself in Lucas? Do you find like Lucas just so beyond anything that you've ever experienced that you find him to be just an interesting or hilarious character? Or does he remind you of something in your life that you might be struggling with, or somebody that you know who has gone through a rough time? How you answer those questions as you go through the journey of reading the book is largely how you're likely to label that book. And so I think one of the things that I'm really proud of as a writer, and if I dare use the word artist, is that my books don't tend to fit easily into genres, because they're really just me trying to figure things out. They're really Matthew Quick novels, and I like it. I take it as a compliment when people say, this is unlike anything that I've read before. That doesn't always help sales, unfortunately. A lot of times people want to read. Sometimes people just want to read something that they're familiar with. They just want to check out. They just want to turn off their brain, and that's fine. But when I'm writing, it's usually me trying to wrestle with some type of personal demon and get that onto the page and figure it out. So I guess, I haven't really answered your question at all, other to say they're Matthew Quick novels, and you've got to give them a try to see if they're for you or not. And I think if you were to listen to this conversation, you'd probably know already whether you're leaning into that or not.
Yeah. Well, one great thing about a good character-driven novel is that while a great plot-driven novel, one with twists and turns, and is a lot of fun to read, and I love those. And there are a lot of those books that I hold in very high regard, but I don't necessarily reread them. I experience that occasionally. I might, but it's one of those things that once you've experienced it, you've kind of been on that trip. A book like We Are the Light is something that I could see revisiting at different points, because I might feel differently about Lucas then. I might sympathize more. I might empathize. I might think that he's, completely off his rocker at one point, and then another time understand it in a weird way. I could see going on this journey with him, a few more times as the years go by. And I really think that is a fantastic thing about books like this, is that we can, like you said, it really depends on what we're bringing to the story, as well as the story that you've told us. And I can't quite put it into words, but that's kind of how I'm feeling about the book right now.
Well, I also think too that, I tend to write about people that would be in the mental health community. And I think that they're in some ways a barometer for how we're dealing with those things in our own life. Like we come to a novel and we read about, so I'll take a voice-driven novel that we all know, like The Catcher in the Rye, which I used to teach in high school. And you'd put The Catcher in the Rye in one kid's hand and they'd be sobbing and mesmerized. And they put it in another kid's hand and they'd be like, I think Holden Caulfield's annoying and I hate him and I don't want to read this novel. And so I think that's a barometer for where people are. And I think that what I try to do with character-driven novel is to kind of test people's empathy, their tolerance, but also try to get them to lean into that, and to get people to understand that, when we walk in someone else's shoes, we try on their brain, especially when you're in a first person intimate novel like We Are the Light. You're really stepping inside of Lucas's skull and you're riding around and seeing what it's like to be Lucas. That takes a fair amount of empathy. That's not a joyride, that's not always a fun thing, but that's a way for us to learn what it's like to be somebody else. So it's a way to combat the narcissism that lives within all of us, because narcissism is, we don't want to think that anyone else thinks differently than we are. Narcissism is, we want what we feel inside to be reflected back to us at all times. So a first person character driven novel if that person is like us, it can be very narcissistically rewarding in saying like, oh, that's me in the page. That's just how I think. That's just how I feel. But sometimes when it's the complete antithesis of how we feel, so for example, when I read Invisible Man, back in the day by Ralph Ellison, like his narrator was delivering an experience that I didn't know. Like I didn't know what it was like to be Black. I think that book takes place in the mid 20th century. I had no idea what that was like, but it was so exciting for me to see the world through this different point of view and to empathize with this character that I had very little in common with, other than the fact that we were both human beings. And so for me, when someone put that in my hand as a young man, it really broadened my sense of what humanity really is, because it brought to the picture something that was very different than my reality. I think people have different tolerance for that at different points in their lives. And I think that that's, not just my work, but first person character driven work is always giving us a chance to kind of shed that narcissistic impulse and to really lean into seeing that everybody experiences this world in radically different ways. Can we be tolerant of that? Can we understand that? Can we try to lean in and sympathize with these people and not just dismiss them? That's I think is the work of being a reader in maybe the highest level. There's nothing wrong for reading for entertainment. I do it all the time. But I think sometimes when we come to literature, it is an empathy-making machine that really puts us through the paces and allows us to practice. It's like working out the empathy muscle. And some of us enjoy that more than others, perhaps, at different times in our lives.
Yeah. When I started getting into the book, I learned very quickly that I had to reach back to my college psychology days and think about Jungian analysis and judging by the white in my beard. It's been a little bit since I was in
I'm
college
right there with
it.
We got a similar style going on. I like it.
That's you go with what you're equipped with, right?
That's right. Yeah.
But there was when we first started talking about doing this show, I figured out pretty quickly that you had done a good bit of press around the book release, and I tried to avoid most of that because I wanted to come and have an organic conversation with you based around my what I took away from the book. But I'm picking up that you've been through some stuff in the last few years. One of the things that I absolutely love to talk to people about is this idea of the moment of creation for a book. That there's maybe there's something that you've been wrestling with, or maybe there's a news story that you saw on the television, and whatever, some sort of catalyst, and the what if game starts playing in your mind, and then maybe a character walks onto the stage of your mind and you're like, who is this guy? And excuse me. And then at some point the book exists, it lives, and you as the writer, it's your job to dig it out and to excavate it and to polish it up, and then we're holding something like We Are the Light in our hands. What was that moment of creation like for you for this book?
It's a little bit of a story, and it goes over years, but this book probably started gestating, forming in my head when I heard about the shooting in Aurora, Colorado in the movie theater. And I am somebody who's always gone to the theater regularly. I'm a big fan of movies. My first date with my wife was to the movie theater in Philadelphia, the Ritz Art House Theater. And so we've always considered the movie theater somewhat of a storytelling church for us. We would go religiously, like we'd go every week, but also we would go to study story, and it was a place where the lights would come down and it would get quiet, and you'd look at these God-sized images on the screen that were illuminated in front of you, and you would transcend your everyday experience. And so Alicia and I were always not just having that wonderful transcendent experience that movies can provide, but also trying to deconstruct it and figure out, how do you do this? How do you make this work? And so the movie theater was a bit of a temple for us. And when the shooting happened, it felt like a violation. Obviously, it's horrific. Most of everybody was affected by it in Colorado. But even after the shooting at Columbine, I was a teacher. I never once thought, I can't go back into a school. Like, it just didn't. I went right back into a school and think about it. But when it happened in Aurora, Colorado, at the movie theater, every time I went to the theater, I was looking over my shoulders and I was looking for the exit, who's sitting behind me. It really changed my experience of going to the movies. And so I started thinking about that a lot. And then I went on book tour for my novel, The Good Luck of Right Now. And this was a while ago. I think this was 2014. And I was invited to do this One Book, One Town event in Ambler, Pennsylvania. And I didn't know where the event was going to be. When I showed up, it was in this historic movie theater. And it's actually the theater that's on the cover. That is the Ambler Theater in Ambler, PA. In the novel, the movie theater is called the Majestic Theater. It's fictional.
Right.
And so I did this event at the Ambler, and it was a packed house. And I got up on stage, and I'm speaking to the audience. It's going very well. But there was this voice in my head, and it kept saying, how do you know that you're safe up here? And I was kind of the movie of that night. And so there was a kind of split. And so there was Matthew Quick on stage engaging with everyone. And then there was this other Matthew Quick that was like scanning the audience, looking to make sure I was safe. It was this weird fractured moment. And after I did a signing line, which was great, there's a lot of people there and everybody was lovely and wonderful. There was no hint of danger in this moment at all, other than that what was constellating inside of me. I went to the bar across the street with the librarians and we had some drinks. And then I came out and I was waiting for my car to pick me up. And I'm looking at the theater, and it's this beautiful cathedral-like theater from 1929, all restored, gorgeous. And I said, I have to write a novel about a movie house. And my original idea was that there was going to be some type of tragedy or shooting in the movie house and what would happen afterwards. My cat, I didn't know, but that was just what I took home. And so I tried to write this movie house tragedy novel for 7 years. And I just couldn't do it. I kept writing false starts and putting it away and quitting on it. And Alicia kept saying, give up on it. Because, usually if I go back and work on things from the past, it never works out. Like, just keep moving forward. But it haunted me. And about 5 years ago, I got sober, and it was this kind of radical transition in my life. And when I got sober, I started to feel a lot of things I hadn't been feeling when I was drinking. And finally, some of my mental health problems started to build and escalate to the point where I needed to get help. And so I reached out and I went into Jungian analysis. And very early on with my analyst, I started to bond with him in this way that was intense and scary and extremely helpful. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had an older man who was invested in not only trying to make me better, but trying to bring out the best version of Matthew Quick. And I became so worried that this was going to be taken away from me that I started to become paranoid about my analyst's health. And I started to worry that he was going to get hit by a car, or he was going to have a heart attack, or maybe I would say the wrong thing in analysis and he would decide he didn't want to work with me. It was this really big fear I had early on of being abandoned, about trusting somebody and being abandoned. And so I worked through this with my analyst, so I'm still working with to this day. And at some point I started to say, what if I had a character who went through a tragedy? And I started thinking about my own movie house idea. What if he had a horrific tragedy in a movie house? And on day one after that tragedy, his Jungian analyst ghosts him, abandons him. What would he do? And that was, once I had that idea, it was like, boom, I was off. And after 7 years of not being able to figure out this novel, and a year of very intense Jungian analysis, I was off and writing this book, and it came out of me in a rush of about 5 weeks. And so,
Wow.
people say, how long did it take you to write this novel? The answer really is, 8 years. But like,
Right.
it was actually sat down and wrote the first draft of the manuscript in a very short amount of time. Once it had, come to fruition inside of me, it came pouring out. So that's the origin story for the novel.
There's something great about what you said because I can relate so strongly. I have a folder on my hard drive with story ideas
Yeah.
of things that ought to be amazing novels. They are,
Yeah.
yeah, I have premises that are just, oh, that's going to make an amazing novel, and they just kind of never go anywhere,
Yeah.
but I have lots of great ideas in them, and there is
Hmm.
something about trying to reach back and find, that was such a great idea. How come it won't go anywhere? Because it's such a great premise and the character is so great. Um, but there is something about there are pieces of those stories that
Yeah.
are maybe meant to go somewhere else. And I love that you had that same experience that the thing that you thought was the story wasn't the story at all, but it was kind of this catalyst to kick off this other story. Um, how do you is there um any way to know what things are going to work? And is this a book idea? Is this just meant to be a piece of a greater puzzle somewhere else? Like how do you handle story ideas and knowing whether something's worth going back to, or it's meant to be something different?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I'm very stubborn, and I don't think that serves me very well. So if I have a story idea that I think is great, sometimes I will spend literally years on it trying to get it
Yeah.
to work. And in the Jungian work I do, my analyst teaches me that if psyche supports something, it will be to do. If psyche doesn't support something, it will shut you down. And for me, I know that that's true. So one metaphor that popped in my head as we were talking, it's almost like I have this junkyard of cars, that don't
Hmm.
run, they won't drive. And if
Right.
I go and insist on making one of these cars run, I will fail and fail and fail. But at one point, I might need a carburetor from that car, or I might need, a hubcap or whatever I need to take from that metaphorical car or story. I
Sure.
can grab that because I know where it is. So I can take that and put it into the new car I'm building and make it work, and I can make that new car run. I think sometimes when we're writing a story, we're just not ready to tell that story. We don't have the life experience. We don't have the lived. We might not have the maturity. It might not be the right time to tell that story. But I think the only way you can tell is by sitting down and trying, and being humble enough to fail. And so, We Are the Light was a story that I tried to write for those 7 years. And each time I sat down, I was convinced that I could do it. And I couldn't figure out why I couldn't do it. I didn't know that for this particular novel, even though it has nothing to do with sobriety, I needed to get sober. I needed to go into Jungian analysis. I needed to meet my analyst. I need to have all of those experiences before I had the insight, the vocabulary, the knowledge, the wisdom to sit down and write this book. It just was not ready to come out of me 7 years previously. So it's trial and error. It's the old saying of serve the story is trite. Like, we all know that, but like, we really are in service of the story. Like, we can't make the story do something that it doesn't want to do. And sometimes the story
Right.
just doesn't want to be born at that time. And you have to have the humility to let that go. In my younger days, I would have rolled my eyes and laughed at all of this talk. When I was a young man in my late 20s, early 30s, I would have said, that's ridiculous. You can do, but I think I've learned to take a more humble approach to storytelling and realize that there are certain stories that want to come out of me at certain times. And I have to have the humility to be in service of them and allow them to come through me the way that they need to come through and to serve that process.
Yeah.
Sometimes that process means writing false starts for 7 years. It's not fun, but that's what it takes.
But that's what it takes, right?
Yeah.
We Are the Light is told in a very unique way. It's told. I'm checking my memory here. It's told exclusively in a
Yeah.
series of letters.
Yeah.
I had to make sure that you didn't deviate from that in a chapter, but
Yeah.
it's told exclusively in a series of letters from Lucas to his analyst.
Yeah.
And what was the idea behind telling the story in that way? And did you, when you kind of cracked that code, did you know that the entire book would be written that way, or did you see it as a series of vignettes? How did that
Mm.
kind of start unfolding?
Well, I was, when I got sober, I went through an intense bout of writer's block. And I was someone who didn't believe in writer's block. And then, I very famously said, there's no thing as plumber, like what people say, there's no plumber's block. It doesn't exist. It's only being lazy. And then it happens to you and you realize, it's serious. And I think that I've heard it said that writer's block is a failure of the ego. I think for me, like alcohol was a big part of my writing process, because it took a lot of strength to be vulnerable. And then I could always hide in the alcohol. I could turn off those emotions and be safe. And so when I lost that safe place of drunkenness every night, I think I was scared and I was afraid to allow myself to go to the places that I previously went when I had been drinking every night. So I didn't know how to break out of this. And when I say I tried to break out of my writer's block, I sat down every single day for years at the computer for 8 hours. And sometimes I couldn't even write a sentence. And I was someone who would write easily 3,000 words, 4,000 words a day. And then all of a sudden I can't write a sentence in a day. It was emasculating. It was terrifying. I didn't know how I was going to make my livelihood. It was really a dark period. And so during this period, the one thing that I could do, and I did do all the time, was write people letters. I like to write handwritten notes. I write email letters. And so I was writing all the time. And Alicia said to me, you can write these letters. You can't write a novel. Why don't you write an epistolary novel, in letters, a book in letters? Maybe it'll work for you. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. It seems gimmicky. I already did that once with The Good Luck of Right Now. Not everybody likes epistolary novels. I do not want to do it. And then 6 months went by, and my good buddy, Nick Butler, I think maybe you had Nick on the show. Did you have?
Yeah.
Yeah, you had Nick on the
Nick's
show.
a great guy.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. I write him letters. And he said, Matthew, you write me letters all the time. Why don't you write an epistolary novel? Why don't you? And I said, you know what, Nick, that's a great idea. I think I'm going to do that. And Alicia's head exploded, and she was so angry with me.
Oh, it's okay for him to tell you that. Gotcha.
And I think it was just like he was seconding it, and I had been worn down another 6 months. But I went down, and I tried to write it, and I just wrote Dear Carl, and it just started to come. And so I'd been blocked for so many years that I thought, I'm not messing with this. I'm just going to go with what the gods are going to allow me to do.
Right.
And so I started writing. The one thing I really love about writing in the letter format is it's so intimate. And so in particular, Lucas is writing to his analyst about his mental health, about his life, it's almost like you're sitting in an analytic session with him. And he's sending these words out into the world, and nobody is writing him back. And so as a reader, you're left with this diary of this really heavy psychic material. And there's that tension of, will anyone reach back and help this man? So it almost creates this ticking clock of where we're able to receive this, but we're not able to write back. And there's the tension. And so it really worked, in my opinion, and it created a lot of tension, a lot of fuel for me to keep going and to keep inhabiting Lucas's mind and to know what it feels like to want to communicate and to contact and to be so desperately giving the best of your soul to somebody, and just waiting for that connection to come back. It was just so rich, and it really took me through. And I think for a lot of reasons, because I think for me, particularly when I got sober, and particularly when I was blocked, there was a lot going on in me that I think when I started talking to my analyst, it was just like I just needed to, to dump it all on him and to get it all out. And he was absorbing that. And so, particularly early on in the analytic sessions, there was a lot of one way. It's not that way anymore. It's very back way. And so, he became this kind of screen that I projected everything onto. And in essence, that's what Lucas does throughout the novel. Even though his analyst isn't there, he's not writing back. And so psychologically, it made sense. And then, of course, there's the metaphor of going to the movies and literally projecting things onto the screen.
Right.
So it kind of projected, and it kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah. Do you find that writing in first person, that there are certain voices that are more comfortable to put on? You told the story that as you're writing as Lucas, and you decide to write these letters as him, that you kind of fall into that character. I wrote a book that's called Writer's Block, and it's in the first person of a novelist who's stuck, and you figure out that he's got all these issues that he's dealing with, and the problem is that he can't write. It's that he can't, get in touch with himself. Anyway, I wrote that in first person present, which was I kind of took that on more as an exercise, really, to see if I could do it, and I found that that I got really close to that character, closer than I had ever experienced before, and while he was way different than me, it was easy for me to fall into that voice. Was it like that for you, that you found yourself kind of falling into Lucas? And writers are the only people that you can have this conversation with, that the voices in their head become, so real. But we can talk to other writers about that. What's that process like for you when you kind of embody this other person, for lack of a better word?
Well, for me, especially I write all of my 9 novels are first person, so I'm always looking for the voice. And that was part of the reason why I was stuck for 7 years, is I couldn't get Lucas's voice right. He's experienced a shooting at a movie theater, and so there's a lot of options, and so how does he respond? And so, I tried angry, I tried funny, I tried, dissociated. I tried all these different ways, and it took me 7 years to kind of slip into his voice. And I think it wasn't until, Lucas is dealing with the loss of his wife, the loss of community members. And so I don't want to be inappropriate and compare this thing, but I think when I got sober, there was this loss of a lot of things in my world. It's not the same thing, but metaphorically, I felt kind of removed, and I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know how to relate to the world. And so I think that allowed me to understand Lucas's psychology in a way that I didn't understand before I went through that process. And so I think that allowed me to kind of find his voice. When I wrote The Reason You're Alive, I loosely based that off of my deceased uncle's Vietnam stories that he would tell me. And when he passed, the night before he passed, he called me and kind of tasked me with writing this book. And for a year, I had no idea how to do it. And I think it took me a year of grieving my uncle before I was able to slip into that voice. Now, the voice of that book isn't 100% my Uncle Pete's voice, but people who knew Pete can tell that it was inspired by him. And I think I was mourning through that process, and it was hard for me to even hear that voice without feeling a tremendous sadness that got in the way of writing that novel. But after maybe it was a year and a half, suddenly I was able to slip into that voice and feel like I could inhabit it without the horrific sorrow of mourning my uncle. And so it's different every time. I go searching, almost fishing, like casting a line into the psyche and trying to find a voice. And, I think there's elements of myself in all of those voices, but I think that it's much more than that.
Yeah.
You're trying to find something that's authentic and real that inhabits you for the telling of the story. And so I think part of that is finding that voice, but I think part of that is also cleaning out the inside of you so that it becomes this perfect host or vessel for the voice to live in while you're writing the book. And so if you have a lot of stuff going on inside, there might not be room for that voice. Such as when I was mourning my uncle, there was a lot of turbulence in there. It wasn't until I finished that emotional process that the voice could inhabit me and I could write that novel.
In the way the publishing landscape is right now for a lot of genres, series are publishers love series, and they love to if readers connect with one book, they want to continue on with those characters. You write standalones. Have you ever had a story that you could see, like when you finish that book, the characters lingered, or maybe you thought, I wonder what happens next with these people? Like, has that ever been a temptation with you?
Only really one time. I wrote a book called Every Exquisite Thing. And in it, there's a novel within the novel. And so the novel in the novel is called The Bubblegum Reaper. And it's this book that these teenagers get obsessed with. It's this out of print novel.
Yeah.
And I had a plan to write The Bubblegum Reaper. I really wanted to do it. And so we talked to the publisher ahead of time, and they're like, sure, like if the book sells enough copies. But then the book was successful, but not successful enough for them to go down that avenue. And I kind of lost interest in it. I don't know. It's not that I wouldn't do it, but it's not something that I've thought too much about. Like I never go back and say, oh, let's write Silver Linings 2 for the, maybe people would like that. I just felt like that story was complete. It was finished. But I have nothing against series, and I think with the publishing landscape, it's really, I don't know that they like series so much as they like whatever sells, so if the series sells a lot of copies, they love it, but the series doesn't sell a lot of copies, they don't like that series. So
true. Matthew, this book's been off of your desk for a while. Did you, when you finished this book, did you feel like you had gotten your mojo back?
I think when I was writing this book, I was so high. Like it just felt so good to be writing. And with the speed I was writing, I felt extremely confident writing this book. And then you shift into editing mode and you shift into promotion mode and you go on book tour. And I wrote the screenplay for this, which I felt really good about that as well. Come down off the high and, you've got to go inside and dig for the next novel, which is what I'm doing now. And, I'm not a person, when I first started writing, my goal was to be a book a year novelist. And in my early years, in my alcohol fueled years, I accomplished that for a good stretch. But I think now in middle life, in sobriety, I'm realizing that there's some wisdom in taking time to go in and to find what you want to do. And I think for my early career, I really put career over mental health. And so I would do anything to get that next book and try to get it out and to keep the career going. And now I think I've learned that the work, for me at least at this point in my life as a novelist, is excavating me, to go inside and figure out who I am. And I think I'm in a bit of a transition period right now where I'm 5 years sober, and I'm just starting to understand what that really means. I think I'm just thawing out with that. And I think also, I'm going to be 50 this year, which is another turning point. And so I've gotten really curious as to what's next and what I want to put into the world, and not to be precious about it. But I'm not a young man anymore. I'm not go, go, go. Like, I'm not, let's see if I could do this. I'm
Right.
taking a more thoughtful tact with that. And that's been interesting. I'm still in Jungian analysis, and that is a deep dive for sure, and into figuring out who I am and to cleaning up a lot of things. And so I'm not sure where that journey is taking me, but I'm curious to find out.
Well, I know I and a lot of other people are really happy that the journey uh, took you here, and We Are the Light
Thank
is
you.
available everywhere now. I'm ordering a number of these to give as gifts to people because the book
Thank you.
meant that much to me, and I know it will mean that much to a lot of other people as well. It's available everywhere. Go visit your local bookstore and support local books. If you need to, we'll put links in the show notes where you can grab it at Amazon. Audible too, I'm sure. I
Yeah.
haven't listened to the audiobook, but I'm sure. Have
Read
you?
by actor Luke Kirby.
I bet that's amazing.
Yeah.
So we'll put links to that as well. Matthew, for folks that are not familiar with all of your work and want to do a deep dive on all things Matthew Quick, what's the best place for them to venture over to online?
Well, my website is matthewquickwriter.com. And I'm also recently just on Substack. So it's matthewquick.substack.com. My Substack is called There Will Be Mistakes. I write about the writing life, mental health, sobriety, all kinds of stuff. And
Nice.
if you subscribe for free, and I send out personal essays a couple times a month. And if you want to subscribe paid, you can too, your choice. But if you want to get to know me and what I'm about, that's probably the best place.
I'm gonna go subscribe right now. That sounds amazing.
Great. Yeah,
Um,
please do.
Matthew, this has been so much fun catching up. Thank you so much for taking time to drop by and to talk about We Are the Light.
Yeah, my pleasure, Hank. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this conversation.